like they do, let me say that some missionaries never reach this point. What's the reason? Because inside, in their inner desire, they want to Americanize the national. They want the national to become like they are. But our purpose is not to nationalize the nationals. I mean, not to Americanize the nationals. Our purpose is to preach the gospel and then for them to make the gospel applicable to their own culture, to the where they can reach their own people. God has enabled me to be very fluent in Spanish. I'm understood almost everywhere I go. Nevertheless, not being a native speaker, meaning not having learned the language as my children did from very young age, I still have an accent. I still mispronounce some words. I still make grammatical errors. There are still vocabulary terms and especially slang expressions I don't know. I am still a foreigner in their culture. Their language is still a second language to me. A speaker in language school said, how can you be a blessing in Spanish if you get your blessings in English? First you have to learn the language well. Then you have to be able to communicate in that language the spiritual truths you're getting from the Word of God. At that point, right at the beginning of my missionary ministry, I began using my Spanish Bible exclusively for devotions. You say, well, didn't you lose a lot? Yeah, you did. Yeah, well, it did. Excuse me. I did lose a lot in the beginning, spiritually, as I was reading in Spanish. But what it did was it helped me to quickly to identify with the people to whom I was sent to minister. That's the purpose we have for coming to the mission field. I learned very quickly the language. My first term, I was translating materials with just a few grammatical and vocabulary corrections that a bilingual lady was helping me with. There was a college graduate in both languages. But the important thing was the identification with their people because of their language. As soon as possible, I'm not saying everybody should do that, but as soon as possible, begin preparing your messages in the tongue of the people. It will make a difference to your disciples. At first, we start out making the message in English and translating it over into the language we're dealing in. As soon as you can, start developing your messages in the language of the people you were sent to minister to. You will then begin to flow. It will begin to come out better and better and better as you do that over a period of time. Titulo. Take time to get out and know the people in their culture and to know their culture. Mix and mingle with the people. Spend time with them, just like you would do in the United States. And don't rush the relationship. Let it slowly grow. We Americans like things done yesterday. But for most foreign nationals, whatever country it is, it's going to be done tomorrow because they're going to have to take time, they're going to have to need the time to get to know you and to feel comfortable with you. That takes time. Siguiente. Cultural adjustments. There are some cultural differences. Siguiente. Si es que hay un siguiente. Some American virtues. Let's look at them. We're dedicated to work. We like to work. We're disciplined more than many other peoples of the world. Not everybody, but we are. We're more organized. That's the cultural characteristic. I personally am not very organized. But as a basis, we are. And Americans are responsible. That's one thing the National said to me. When a missionary comes down and forgets to keep his appointments, forgets to keep his commitments, or something of that nature, the Nationals look at that missionary as irresponsible. Why? Because they're used to us missionaries doing what we say we're going to do. That's an American virtue. But some American vices, as are explained by the Nationals, and I'm going to tell you some. Remember I said this was going to focus on the Nationals, even if it puts us down. We're blunt-spoken, and we're very imposing. That is offensive to many national cultures. We're easily angered. If things don't go our way, we explode. In the United States, that doesn't bother the other person. They just kind of roll with the punches because they're the same way. That's also, you've got to do with temperament and all that. I realize that. But it's more common in the United States to accept it and not think anything of it. In many cultures, that's very offensive, especially in Latin America. Visiting established churches only at furlough time to take pictures. This is what one national pastor told me. He didn't like that at all, needless to say. He had wanted some help from the missionary, The missionary didn't give him any help, but he sure was quick to go over there and take pictures one time, came to go on furlough. Refusing certain foods with no justifiable reason. If you go into a home, for example here, and you say, I'm sorry, I can't drink coffee, it bothers my stomach, they'll understand. But if you just turn your nose up at their food. We went back to visit some Indians back in the mountains of Honduras about 20 years ago, very, very primitive Indians. And we slept on a board in the community center, if you want to call it that. And we go into their homes, and the pigs would go in the homes with us. And I mean, they traveled through the homes, and they left their, their droppings as they went along, and the chickens and the ducks and everything else. I mean, it was filthy. And they came over and they gave us some food, beans and maybe a little bit of a chicken. And the chicken was so tough, like it broke my teeth. But that's all they had. As a matter of fact, they didn't eat them because they didn't have enough to give. But they were giving us some. And you think to yourself, well, now how did they wash these dishes? Are there parasites in the dishes? So forth and so on. I can't eat that. Turn your nose up at them. Very offensive. Now, if there's a justifiable reason, and you can say, I'm sorry. And now I've got to the point I can say, I don't like that. They understand that. I just don't like it. There are certain foods here that I don't like it. But most of the food they eat here, I eat just right with them. It doesn't bother me. And they know that. So if you don't have a justifiable reason, eat it, because that's the grounds of fellowship. Jesus broke bread and ate fish with his disciples. We eat with them. And if you don't have a reason for not eating. There are missionaries that come down and everything they have, they buy it a can, or everything's got to be, in a bottle or what have you. They're not going to go out and eat with the nationals. They're not going to have much done either. Not eating with the nationals. Eating with them gives confidence. They feel comfortable with you when you can eat over the dinner table. I don't mean you have to have them with you every time you eat. I'm not talking about that. You find out how you're going to do it, when you're going to do it. Speaking with missionaries in English when the nationals are present. There are times we do. But try to be very careful that you don't do that all the time. They'll be offended at it. Asking a fellow missionary home while putting the visiting national speaker in a national's home. That's what one national told me. Hey, when he has a special speaker in, if he's a missionary, he stays with the missionary. But if he's a national, he puts him out with the nationals. What he's doing is saying that the missionaries are better than the nationals. That should not be the case. Have some nationals stay in your home with you. We have nationals stay at our home, and they love to do it. They're wonderful people, just the same as our American brothers missionaries are. A lack of fellowship and communion. Not just fellowship, but communion. I mean, there are some missionaries that go to service, they preach, they go to visitation, and they knock on doors to get people to go to church, but that's as far as they'll associate with the people. You've got to have communion with them. There is a need to know if you are willing to help and in what manner. I'm not just talking about a new church that you're going out to establish. I'm talking also about with the national pastors. As God gives you national workers in the ministry that you begin on your particular field, you've got to have communion with them. And as you have communion with them, they may expect you to give them money, but you teach them, hey, that's not what I'm here for. Let me tell you what I'm here for. But as you have communion with them, they understand what they can come to you to receive. Then compliment any positive results of each ministry. At first, it's with the people as they grow in Christ. Compliment that they're reading the Bible, or they're beginning to pray, or they're in faith, whatever. But learn to use compliments. We have a custom as humans to be constantly belittling each other. We should learn to compliment each other. And then another thing is to throw papers on the table instead of handing them to the person. Needless to say, this particular pastor that was telling me these things doesn't have a high opinion of the missionary to whom he was referring. But this could be a case with any other national pastor and any other missionary that doesn't have a high regard for the nationals. There are some Latin virtues, and they're very strong virtues. They have a strong family loyalty and strong family ties. When they get saved, one of the first things they want to do is reach their own family. Hey, I got friends over here. I got family over here across town or across the city or in these other towns. They're diplomatic in their sensitivity when dealing with others. They're very diplomatic. And in the Orient, it's even more prominent. The diplomacy they have when they're dealing with each other. They're more relaxed regarding time. Our churches in the country especially, not all of them, some of them are very punctual, but most of them say they start. One of the pastors said, well, we'll tell them 1:30 and we'll start at 2. That's not lying to them. Some of the people walk 4 hours to get to services. And so, they might be late 15 or 20 minutes. But at the same time, this is not a The doctors here don't make appointments. You go into the doctor when you get there. You just stand in line and wait your turn. Why? Because if they make appointments, the people aren't going to keep them anyway. So what's the sense of making them? That's just the way of life in this particular part of the world. And then unreserved dedication to their friends. When they're a friend, they're a friend. Now remember, whatever the culture is, it won't necessarily have the same virtues and vices of a Latin culture. But they are going to have their virtues, and they are going to have their vices. Don't just zero in on their vices and say, look at how dumb these people are. What are some of their vices? It's a matriarchal society. A big percentage of the men here drink. It's a real problem. So the mother has to raise the children. What does this also mean? Male irresponsibility. When they get saved, that changes. Thank the Lord. They'll lie rather than offend. One missionary was telling about an experience he had. They needed a particular type of wood out of the jungles. And so they were almost all day looking for that particular tree. And then finally, when it was about the time he'd have to have that, to be able to cut it, trim it, and carry it back, he said, isn't that one of those trees over there? And they all said, yeah, that's the tree. Well, it wasn't until he got it back that he found out it wasn't. But he wanted it to be the tree, and they knew that. So, rather than offend them, they lied. You say, that's wrong. That depends on your cultural viewpoint. To what point? I'm not saying it's right, but that depends on your culture. A lack of organization. They procrastinate. They wait to get things done. After you've been in the field, on the field for a long time, you begin to assimilate some of these things. And they're not all bad. And they're not all unjustifiable. Then another thing is they're very vengeful toward their enemies, at least here in Honduras. Be careful what you say, because it might come back to you at the point of a machete or at the point of a pistol, and that's a fact of life. That's why they're very diplomatic with each other. And then the lack of equality toward women. Women are usually, a little bit like in some Arab countries, it's better to be the mule, the man's mule, than it is to be his wife. At least the mule's worth something, so he treats it better. So most foreign countries where Christ has not been preached and has not been lived, women usually are an inferior species among the human race in that particular culture. Siguiente título. Cultural shock. You will suffer through this phase of missionary adjustment. You will. In Honduras, for example, expressions of appreciation are very rare. They are very rare. They're very, very conscientious to say good morning. When they greet you, they will greet everybody in the room if there's a possibility of doing it. They'll walk in the service 10 minutes later and they'll say, good evening, just out loud. You might be in the middle of a singing, you might be in the middle of the preaching. Good evening. But it's hard for them to express appreciation. That's just something they're not taught. They appear irresponsible. They're really not irresponsible, but many times they appear. They're not direct when speaking about their needs or problems. I remember one time one of the men came to visit me, and he was in the Bible Institute in the evening and in school in the morning, high school, finishing high school. He was about 20-something years old, and he worked in his carpenter shop in the afternoon, so it wasn't that he wasn't busy. But he came and he said, nice day, isn't it, and this and that and the other, and he went all over the place for about 45 minutes. Didn't really say a thing, and then he said, can I borrow a particular book? It took him 45 minutes. That's just the way it is, and you've got to learn how the people speak, and you've got to learn to speak like they do, to the manner that they do. And so you've got to learn their culture and to become comfortable with it. Do not get frustrated trying to make them Americans. Our culture is not divinely ordained. Look what's happening to our culture in the United States of America as our American people turn more and more away from God. Our culture is not divinely ordained. God has blessed it, had it raised up to a high level. Sad to say, it is falling. But it is still not divinely ordained. Culture is not divinely ordained. Someday, returning to the States, you will then suffer reverse cultural shock. There are times I go back to the States, and about 6 weeks later I think, hey, I've been in cultural shock. Because you're then not accustomed. We live back here in the mountains, mainly among the Latins most of the time, the Hondurans most of the time. When I go to the cities, I work with the men. I'm with them day in and day out. So when I get into a purely American culture, it shocks me. One of the men of the church told the pastor said, well, he should understand. And the man who's been down here a number of times says, no, he's Honduranized. He's Latinized. He doesn't understand. It's different. You will suffer it the longer you stay on the mission field. But that's what it takes to be able to build a work for Christ. Siguiente título. Starting a church. First, an audience must be contacted. I'm not reading from the scripture all these references. You can do that yourself. Acts 13, verses 14 through 16. Chapter 14, verse 1, 16, verses 13 through 15. And the gospel must be communicated. Acts 13, 17 to 41, and 16, 31. You don't only have to contact the audience, that means getting out and visiting, you have to communicate the gospel. That means they have to understand what you're saying. That goes back to what I said about language and culture. Identification. You have to be able to communicate with them. Let's look at the areas to start a church. Seek an area where there are no churches of like faith. Now let me say, in many parts of Latin America, it's become that way here in Honduras, there are churches in many communities. And there are denominations that are basically Baptistic, though they're not Baptist. For example, the Bible Church. Their doctrine is very Baptistic. You don't want to go in and start a church down the street from a Bible church. Find an area where there's no church of like faith. I'm not talking about those that have doctrine different than ours, and those of an Armenian doctrine, you can lose your salvation, the Pentecostal, I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about those that have a Baptistic doctrine. We should respect them. They preach basically the same thing we do. Let's pray God gives them souls and develops a good church, and go to an area where there is not a good Baptist church. A detailed feasibility of the selected area is advisable. What's the terrain? What type of terrain is it? What's the population? Is there growth, or is there a decline in the population? What's the economy? For example, where we live in La Esperanza, back here in the mountains, it's an agricultural community, basically agriculture. They do have a big teaching school here, a high school for teachers, and other things of like nature, but not that much. It's basically agriculture. On the North Coast, where we have two churches, it's industry. It's the industrial center of the country. It's very hot there. Here it's colder. This is called the icebox of Honduras. There it's the oven of Honduras. It's very hot in San Pedro Sula. And then in Tegucigalpa, where we started, it's basically government. So find out what kind of people you're dealing with, where they work, what kind of economy it is. And then sociological. What are the ethnic groups? What about social class? What social class do you want to work with? We started out with the poor people. In the capital city, we tried to work later, after establishing our first church, with a higher class of people, an upper class of people, but it didn't work. It didn't work for one reason, because of separation. The lower class expects separation from movies, from party going, from drinking and such and so. The people of the upper class would not accept that you tell them they shouldn't do that. I didn't tell the people in the lower class they needed to separate from those things. They just believed it innately. But in the upper class, I wasn't going to be able to do that. And it created a problem, and then nothing ever came of it. So if you're going to start with the upper class, start there. Religion. Is it Christian or non-Christian? How many religions are there? Is it just one, or there are various? Siguiente título. Initial contacts. Let's look at starting with pre-evangelistic courtesy contacts. You don't necessarily go in to preach to them, but you want to get to know community leaders, government officials, mass media representatives. I'm not saying that's the way I did it, but that is an excellent way to begin your ministry on a particular field. Limited area evangelism. As you go out knocking door to door, there's a problem, especially like here in Honduras, even out where we're at. That particular method is being used and abused by the Jehovah's Witnesses and by the Mormons. We have to learn to use that particular method in a very wise way. Determine the number of contacts that can be effectively dealt with at a given time. Don't spread yourself so thin that you're going to have a problem getting back to the people you've already dealt with. There is a problem, and there will be problems when there is not a quick follow-up. The interested people may be turned off, 20 future dealings. You've just let them drift. And then also false cults could win them. Don't get spread out so thin, again, that you can't deal with the ones that you've got. And then mass contacts, getting out to a big area at once. A large tent erected in a strategically located lot in a target community. Use the method that you feel most comfortable with, the one that you feel you want to use. A church can begin with just women. That's what Paul started with in Philippi, with Lydia. But it cannot be strong without men. To reach the men through the women, you have to teach the women biblical principles about marriage. Don't forget, they were not raised with a Christian background. They don't know the Bible. First, biblical submission. That doesn't mean that they're, stepped on. You know how to teach that. Respect for their husband. Man needs respect, and they really don't know how to do it. The care of the home. Many times they don't even know how to take care of their home, especially if you're in a very, very poor environment. Her changes should bring him to the services. Then teach him about biblical leadership in the home, how to be a loving, responsible husband, about loving his wife and his children, about being a responsible father to his children, bringing food home. In many countries of the world, especially poorer countries, drink is a real problem. And so they drink up most of the money. That used to be the case and still the case in many areas of the United States of America. Siguiente título. There's a need of a church with a family-oriented ministry. Not just men, not just women, not just children. You have to start maybe with one or the other, or a combination of two of the three. But it has to be family-oriented. My wife has a ladies' ministry. There is a need of a ladies' ministry. As I said before, women in many countries are little more than slaves. My wife has a ministry with the youth. She loves the youth. She planted a youth ministry in our first church in the capital city. And then from that developed joint youth meeting among the churches. We have a fellow missionary has a youth camp out here for the youth to come to. And they come every Easter week, every Holy Week. Here in Latin America from Wednesday afternoon to Sunday, Resurrection Sunday, or Easter Sunday as we say it in English, they're off. And so we have special camps for the young people. And most of the camps here in Latin America flooded during Easter week. And now, a few years ago, she started yearly ladies' Bible conferences to provide for the specific needs of the ladies. There's spiritual nourishment that's taught by women. Most of our messages, let's face it, most of the messages that we preach as men are geared to the men. Get out and evangelize, do this, do that. And very few of the messages we preach are geared to the women, but they need spiritual nourishment also at their level. And then they get a chance to have spiritual fellowship with other Christian ladies. If in the future you get a chance to do it, do it. We don't, my wife doesn't allow children to come. They have to be 25 years old or older if they're unmarried, and any age if they're married, of course, but without their children unless they're breastfeeding. And then that gives them a time away from the children so they can just relax and enjoy the things of the Lord. Children's ministry. Most of the third world countries abound in children. Most third world countries, families are big. 60% of Honduras's population, the whole country, is under 20 years of age. In the capital city, it's about 90% of the population. Like everywhere, like anywhere else, parents can be reached through the children. Have a good children's program to reach the parents, just like in the United States of America. The missionary must show that the family and home have priority. The church exists because of the family. We have to have families to have a solid church, and the church should serve the family. We're complementary. We can't do the one without the other. Without a strong family, without strong families in a church is not strong. Siguiente título. In the city. Let's look at the normal U.S. method. Método. ¿Verdad? Rent a building and put up a sign. That's the way I started. Advertise depending on the neighborhood. Bulletins on the telephone poles or A loudspeaker. We started out with a film strip presentation in the streets. And I'm talking about 30 years ago, 28 years ago. We started out with a film presentation in the streets with a loudspeaker because we could do it where we were. But you have to decide that depending on where you work. Present something special. Now you can use movies. Whatever it takes to get the people to come in to make noise in your community. A Honduran method of doing it. They believe you go out and hand out tracts and witness door to door. You start out on a personal level. To do that, you might consider a chick tract 5-day visitation plan. First, you select a limited area where you want to work. How many houses do you feel you can deal with? Hand out the tract with only a greeting. Don't witness the first 2 days. Just give them the tract and ask them to read it. And then on the third day, you start witnessing. You're going back to the same houses now. You start witnessing as the Holy Spirit opens the door. Enrolled unsaved individual in Source of Light's correspondence course, if it's available in your language. Offer them something they can study. Return personally with each succeeding book. That's for those that don't get saved. So you're going out with the chick tracts. That gets the gospel message. If they don't get saved, they've heard just about everybody's going to read a comic book, especially if it's free. And then some will want to study the correspondence course. It's a very good correspondence course. Or have a 3 to 5 day campaign with movies. Write names and addresses of the converts, just like you would in the United States of America. Again, enroll the unsaved individuals in the course. Get them started. Because then you can say, I'll come back and collect the books as you go back. That's what one pastor said. He would go back, and the next Saturday he'd say, I'll come back on Saturday, collect the book, and give you your next book. And he did. Well, if they didn't do it, he wouldn't read them the riot act. If they get aggravated with them, he'd tell them, well, maybe next week you'll have time to do it. I'll be back next Saturday. Of course, after 3 or 4 Saturdays, if they don't do it, you just give them up. But there will be some that'll keep doing it, and that'll give you an opportunity, an excuse to keep going back to these people. And you don't have to be forceful. Don't be forceful. Again, let it come naturally. And you need to return personally with each succeeding book. As you get nationals trained, of course, they'll begin to do it, which is what has happened here. We would suggest having a home Bible study. We're doing that now. My purpose of the Bible study with business people and some professional people in the town we're in is eventually to filter them out into the local churches that we have here. We don't necessarily need another church in this community, another Baptist church. We got some good ones started now. But that's a good way to start churches where you're at. Of the 69 churches planted in Portugal, 38 started in a home. And don't expect them to start right away. Now, one of the disadvantages is there is no sense of responsibility with a Bible study. Your objective is to get them into church, and get them faithful in Sunday school and the preaching hour and so forth and so on. But get them used to you. Get them used to what you preach and what you teach and what you believe. Get them to where they accept what you're teaching. And then little by little, bring them in. You won't get them all, but you'll get enough to get your church either started or growing. Service can be started as the interest increases if you've got nothing going. As they get interested, then you can start suggesting services. This slower method is better as it cultivates their confidence. You have to earn their confidence. Working the upper class, you have to use contact evangelism. First, it's been suggested you begin where they socialize. A country club, a golf course, whatever. Without compromising your biblical convictions. You don't go in and just because they're drinking a little bit of wine, you're going to drink it. I mean, you don't compromise your biblical convictions. In Latin America, the maid answers to the door, so cold visitation is impossible. That's why you have to start with some kind of a social contact. We'll continue in the next lesson. Yeah. Lower class makes it difficult to move to